We've got one more voting method we're going to discuss here. It's the so-called pairwise comparison method. Now, the big picture behind this approach is that if one candidate is preferred by more voters over other candidates in one-on-one comparisons, that should make a difference. So what we're going to do is we're going to write out every possible pair of candidates, every head-to-head matchup, and go through them one at a time, determining which of the two got the most votes. That candidate will get a point, or in the event that there's a tie, we split it up and each of them gets a half a point. Okay, so let's look at an example. Well, I've got a preference table here, right? So we can see how some people voted. And in the matches table below, I've written all of the possible two candidate matchups. And when you're doing this in some ways is the hardest part, because if you miss one, then you're going to just completely screw up your results. So when you do this, it's best to be methodical, right? I said, okay, first let's do all the ones that start with A. Let's A versus B and A versus C. Then I said, okay, now let's go to the next one. Let's do all the ones that start with B. Well, I didn't want to do B versus A because the order doesn't matter. And I've already got those two up in the first row. So I did B versus C. And then that was it. For the next row, I would have C versus A, but I've already got that on row 2. And then C versus B, but I've already got that on row 3. So ultimately, we're going to have 3 matchups that we have to consider. Okay, so let's start with A versus B. Go up to the table. There are 3 columns where A was preferred to B. That's these 3 here. Right? In the 16-vote column, A was first, B was second. In the 4-vote column, A was first, B was third. And in the 8-vote column, A was second, B was third. In the 6-vote column, it's the other way around. Right? I didn't include that one because in that one, B was preferred to A. So if you add up the votes, we have 18 votes for A, 6 votes for C. 6 votes for B, excuse me. A wins this matchup, so A gets a point. Okay, now we're going to do it again. Now go to the next one, A versus C. Okay, again, I'm running through the columns, seeing which ones have A higher than C. Well, that's going to be these 2, right? First versus third in the 16-vote column, and first versus second in the 4-vote column. And if you look at the other 2, both of those have C higher than A. Okay, so for this one, where did we end up? Well, A has 10 votes. A has 20 votes. C has 14. A is the winner. A gets the point. Okay. Now, I always tell my students, always try to be looking a little bit ahead. Okay, what are the totals looking like at this point? Well, there's only 1 point left to go, and A already has 2 points. So there's only 2 possibilities here. We end up 2 to 1 to 0, in which case A wins, or we end up 2 to 0 to 1, in which case A wins. Right? So I tell my students, if you're doing this on a test, you're done. You can already tell me that A is the winner. Save yourself some effort. Okay, but for the sake of practice, right? Since we're new to this, let's go ahead and do the next calculation so we can see, how it ends up looking. So now I'm going to do B versus C. There's only one column where B is the winner. Columns in the 6, 4, and 8 vote columns, C is higher rated than B. So what do we end up with? C gets 16 points. B gets 18 points. No, sorry, I said that backwards. B gets 16 points. C gets 18. So C gets the vote, or gets the point. C ends up with 1. Our total is 2, 0, and 1. Just like I said, A ends up being the winner. Okay, so let's take a look at another one. Bigger table. More going on here. We've got 4 candidates, so the number of rankings has increased. Assuming that the number of matches has increased. Again, I've tried to be very methodical. You see I did a B, a C, a D. Those are all the ones that start with A. Then BC and BD. Again, left out B versus A because that's covered in row 1. And then one more row for the C versus D matchup. Okay, so walk through those columns, right? If you look at A versus B, A gets the 16-vote column, the 8-vote column, and the 10-vote column. That gives a total of 34 points. B gets the remaining 25. A comes out the winner. Okay, A versus C. I did these in advance, right? So if you please go through and do this yourself. Pause the presentation, work about, get some practice in. I'm not going to make you sit through having me do all this arithmetic again. A versus C comes out to 45 versus 14, so that one goes to A. A versus D comes out to 28 versus 31. 31 is higher, right? So D gets those points, that point. B versus C, that's 45 to 14. B is the winner. B versus D, that's 34 to 15. B comes out the winner again. One more to go. C versus D, this was a close one. 30 versus 29. The point goes to C. And we end up in a little bit of a pickle here, actually. When we do the totals, we get 2, 2, 1, and 1. So we've got a tie. Okay, what do we do? Well, the situation is the same with all of these voting methods. None of them really specify how to handle a tiebreaker. That's something I mentioned this way back in our very first lecture. That's something that you need to consider in advance. If you get to this situation, what are you going to do? Are you going to look back and say, well, who got the most first place votes originally? I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable method. You could say, okay, well, let's try doing a different method. Try, plurality with elimination, see what that gives you. All sorts of options. You need to have that thought through in advance because these methods themselves generally don't tell you. Okay, so that's the last of our voting methods. We've talked about plurality, we talked about majority, we talked about the Borda method, the Borda count method. We've done plurality with elimination, and we've done this one, the pairwise comparison method. Okay, I've mentioned off and on throughout the previous lectures, all of these methods have, I don't necessarily want to say flaws, but they all have the potential to give us results that somehow violate a rule that we think the results for voting should follow. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture. There's a number of different criteria we expect elections to have. We expect voting results to have. We're going to talk about those, and then we'll look at some examples of situations where those criteria are not met using these voting methods that we've talked about as examples.